Our Christmas series this year is titled Fit for a King. We're going to be looking at the gifts that were brought by the Magi when they came to see Jesus. The primary significance of the gifts, as we read in the story of Matthew, was their great value. It showed the status of the men that were bringing the gifts. And when contrasted with the lowly shepherds who may have possibly brought nothing to the stable, it shows that Jesus came for all mankind, regardless of economic status or what lot they may have in life. Scripture doesn't really attach any other symbolic meaning to the gifts, but I believe that there is more significance than just their value. If the value of the gifts wasn't important, then Matthew could have just mentioned that they brought expensive gifts, but he specifies what the gifts were. So we're going to try to look at the meaning behind those gifts. We're going to be looking at each of the gifts and what they represented. I don't believe the wise men just casually chose what gifts. I don't think they did what some of us do when we're selecting our Christmas gifts and simply started walking through a store and said, I wonder if something's going to catch my eye. What might this person want? Oh, I think they might want that. I don't think they simply went through their closet and said, oh, here's something that I'm not using. Maybe I can re-gift it. I think they put a lot of thought into the gifts that they brought. Today we're going to talk about the first gift, the gift of gold. But before we get into that, let's read the story of the Magi as we see it written in Matthew. Matthew chapter 2, starting with the verse 1 says, After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, Where is the one who has been born, King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all of Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. In Bethlehem, in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time that the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him. After they had heard the king, they went on their way. And the star that they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Before we look at the first gift, let's talk a little bit about these men. Who were they? Where did they come from? Why would they make such a long journey to visit a baby from another nation that they really had no connection to? Although the Bible doesn't state specifically where the men came from, early church tradition and history say they probably came from Persia. It is believed that they are from the same group of wise men that we read about in the book of Daniel. These wise men were among the highest ranking officials in Babylon. They were monotheistic, which means they believed that there is only one God. They didn't know yet who this God was, but they were always studying and searching for this God. They were students of agriculture, science, mathematics, history, and astrology, among other things. They also dabbled in occultism and studied other religions in their quest to find the truth. Because of their wisdom, kings would come to them for advice. Their initial rise to power came during the Babylonian Empire. King Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, and Darius, the three kings that Daniel served under, all sought wisdom from these men when they had decisions to make. Often, their insight was correct, but because they didn't personally know God and were searching for answers elsewhere, sometimes they also interpreted things incorrectly. In chapter 1 of Daniel, we learn that because of the wisdom that God gave to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, also known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel, King Nebuchadnezzar placed those 4 young Israelite men in his group of advisors or wise men. Then in chapter 2, we read about a dream that Nebuchadnezzar had which troubled him deeply. The only one of his advisors, wise men, that was able to interpret the dream was Daniel. And because of that, we're told that Nebuchadnezzar put Daniel in charge of all his wise men. Because of his high position and the respect that Daniel had from the other wise men, it seems certain that the wise men of his day would have learned much from him about the one true God and God's future plans for redeeming the world through a coming king. These wise men would have been among the first to hear Daniel's prophecies of the Messiah. Daniel chapter 9 records a clear prophecy of the Messiah and gives a timeline for when the Messiah would come. The timeline begins with the decree to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And Daniel prophesied, if you work the timeline, he prophesied that it would be approximately 490 years from that decree to the coming of the Messiah. For generations, this and other prophecies had undoubtedly been passed down through generations of magi. And by doing the math, these wise men that we read about in Matthew knew that the time for the Messiah to arrive was at hand. Have you ever wondered how the wise men knew that they were supposed to follow the star? No place in the Bible does it specifically prophesy that there would be a star. At least, not the way things are translated into our English Bible. But there are a few other prophecies that could have been interpreted by the wise men to be a sign if they were already looking for the Messiah to come at that time. One example is Isaiah chapter 9, verse 2. Says, the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. We always assume that one night the wise men were just out looking up at the sky and they saw a strange star and the star seemed to be moving slowly, and immediately they said, oh, that's what we've been looking for. We need to follow that star. It's going to take us to the Messiah. But the text doesn't specify that. I think that what really happened was they saw a star they had never seen before. And they started searching scriptures and other writings and anything they could. That's what they did. They were astrologers. When they would see something in the sky, they would try to figure out what it meant. So they saw this star that they had never seen. They said, there's a new star. This must mean something. What does it mean? So they started searching for the answers to that star. It's possible that as they were searching for the meaning of the star, and also knowing that the Messiah was supposed to come, they began to search scriptures, and they read this prophecy in Daniel that talked about a light, a great light that would come in the darkness. And they put the two together and they said, hey, this is a sign of the Messiah. Let's go, let's find this newborn king. The key takeaway for us there is that they were seeking. Many people missed the coming Messiah. Other people were expecting him, but they missed it because they had given up seeking. They'd either given up hope and said, we've been looking for years, it hasn't come, or they were too busy with life and everything that was going on to really seek the truth. They had settled for a form of religion, but they had no desire to really know truth. Wise men still seek him. And in Jeremiah 20:13, it promises that if we seek him, it says, you will seek me and find me if you seek me with all your heart. Another common misconception about the wise men is they simply followed this star all the way from Persia. Now, if they had been following the star and were convinced that this star was leading them to the Messiah, why did they stop to ask King Herod where the baby was? Why didn't they just keep following the star until it stopped? Allow me to point out a couple of verses that seem to show a different version of the story than what we've always been taught. Matthew chapter 2, verse 2, we read, it says, and they, talked about the wise men, and they asked, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. Notice they didn't say, we have been following his star from our land. We have been following his star for months or maybe a year. We've been following the star. Instead, they simply said, We saw his star when it rose. We know what it means. It means that the king is born. Where is he? They already knew that the Messiah was to be the king of the Jews. So where's the most logical place to look for the king of the Jews? Jerusalem, the capital city, and the palace. So that's where they went. That's where they would expect to find a king of the Jews. Now, look at verses 9 and 10. It says, after they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. Why would they be overjoyed to see the star? If they had been seeing that same star for months already, if they had already been following that star, why were they overjoyed at this time to see the star? I think what happened was they saw the star while they were in Persia. And after discovering what it meant, they hightailed it to Israel. But it wasn't until they got to Herod's palace and left the palace that the star reappeared. And at that time, it began to lead them to where they would find the baby. Which brings us to the question of why they would bother to put their lives on hold and spend several years possibly by the time they got there. We don't really know how long it was. We know that they had seen the star 2 years earlier. That's what they told Herod. We saw his star 2 years ago, but we don't know if they immediately started their journey at that time or if it took them several months to figure out what the star was before they started the journey. They were about 1,000 miles away. So it would take approximately 4 months just to make the journey. So at least 4 months of travel there, 4 months back, possibly longer, depending on how many miles they traveled in a day. But why would these men from Persia stop their jobs, leave their families? Why would they sacrifice so much to go visit a king that wasn't even their king? Well, it's because somehow they knew that even though Jesus would have the name King of the Jews, he could also be their king. They had spent their whole lives searching for the one God. They believed in one God. And they said, this man may be born to be the king of Israel, but he can be our king too. We want to go see our king. They came to swear their allegiance to the God that they had always believed in, but never met. They came not only to see the King of the Jews, but to see the King of their own life. Which brings us to verse 11. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. They opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Notice that before they presented the gifts, they bowed and worshiped. When we hear the word worship, we almost always think of music. I wonder what song the wise men sang. What style of music was it? Were the words in a hymnal that they had brought with them on their camel, or did they read them off a wall? I love music. Music can be used in worship, but music in itself is not worship. We often think we've worshiped when all we've done really is we've attended a concert. We've gone and listened to the good music and said, oh, wasn't that great? Wasn't that great worship? But if our hearts weren't in it, if we weren't actually connecting ourselves, it's really not worship, no matter what kind of song or what style or what instrumentation or whatever. Worship can be music, or music can be worship. But music in itself isn't worship. And I don't think the wise men were singing. We do have stories in the Bible where people worship. Paul and Silas in jail, they sang to God. But here it just says they bowed and worshiped. Bowing is a form of worship. It's a sign that the person we are bowing to is more important than we are, and that we are submitting to their authority. It was customary for someone to bow before a king. When you see a king, you bow to them to signify that you are the king and I am your humble servant. It is a form of showing worth, showing value. So that was the first thing they did in worship, is they bowed, they submitted, they said, we are lower than you are. Think about that, a little baby. And they said, you are higher position than we are, with all of our knowledge that we've accumulated over the years. You are our king. We submit to you. Sometimes a person will bow in a king's presence because they're afraid of him. Maybe they've done something wrong and they've been called into him for judgment. And so they'll bow, hoping to gain his favor. Or they'll come in, they have a request of the king, and so they bow, hoping to get on his good side, butter him up to get something. That's not what these men were doing. They simply acknowledged that he was king. We bow before you in worship. The Bible says that on Judgment Day, every knee will bow before the King of Kings. But for many of them, it'll be too late. They should have made their choice to put themselves under his authority before Judgment Day. The wise men weren't bowing out of fear. They were bowing in reverence. They weren't forced to bow. They chose to bow. They were admitting that this small child, even though he was still a child, was more important than they were. They were acknowledging the right that he had to rule, and they were submitting to him. The simple fact that the wise men had put everything else on hold to seek out the Christ child was also a form of worship. They made Christ a priority. They said, you know what? Meeting this person and making him Lord of our lives, this is more important than anything else. There are many different ways we can show our worship to the King of Kings. The wise men worshiped first, and then they gave gifts. The gifts were a result of their worship, not the other way around. Now, this is important because sometimes I think we have things in the wrong order. I think we're all guilty at times of giving a sacrifice or a gift in some way to gain God's favor. Well, maybe if I give this money in the offering, or well, maybe if I spend an hour this morning instead of my normal 15 minutes reading or something, maybe God will give me a little bit more favor. And so we'll do something, we'll sacrifice something, give some kind of a gift, hoping to get something out of God. The wise men didn't give gifts to bribe God or to earn any favors. They gave gifts because they had already given their hearts. Have you noticed that it's easy to give gifts to someone who has your heart? When you love someone, it's easy to give a gift. It's not a chore. It's not like, well, I guess I have to give something. When we love somebody, we give because they already have our heart, and giving gifts flows from that heart of love, that heart of worship. Notice too, that the wise men had already come with their gifts. The gifts weren't an afterthought when they saw the Christ child. They didn't say, oh, this is a king. I wish we would have brought something. I wonder what we have in our backpacks. They had already determined before they even started their journey that they were going to submit to the authority of this new king. And because they had already made him king in their hearts, they had brought gifts to show their love and their appreciation for this king. Now we get into the main theme of today's message. The first gift they gave was gold. Gold, especially in those days, was a symbol of nobility and royalty. Gold was one of the chief measures of how much a person was worth. It was an expectation that anyone coming to visit a king would bring a gift for the king. Even peasants would bring gifts when they came to a king. A peasant might only bring a chicken, and that's his gift, but he would bring something. People who had more wealth would bring more expensive gifts. And if they were at all able, it was an expectation, because sometimes they would bring multiple gifts, but it was an expectation that at least part of the gift they brought would contain gold. Gold was a symbol of you are king. 1 Kings tells us about all the people that would come to visit King Solomon. It says each person would bring gifts to the king when they came. And it mentions many different gifts that were given, but each time gold is mentioned along with it. They gave this and this and this, and then they also brought, and it always tells how much gold they brought. A big deal is made about how much gold was given to Solomon. If we keep reading in 1 Kings, it tells us that Solomon had so much gold that had been given to him that everything he owned was either made of gold or overlaid in gold. Most of that had come to him as gifts from people who came and said, "You are the king." Giving gold to a king in those days was a way to acknowledge that somebody was the king and that they had the authority to rule. The Bible talks about two kingdoms, the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of earth. We all know who is in charge of the kingdom of heaven, but who's in charge of the earthly kingdom? Well, really, that all depends on you and on me. The Bible teaches that everything should be God's kingdom. Jesus told us to pray, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Jesus wants to rule here on earth too, not only in heaven. However, he won't take the earthly throne by force. He allows us to choose who will be king here on earth. Living in God's kingdom here on earth is an individual choice. Each person must decide in their own heart who will be king. It really doesn't matter what everyone else decides. God can be king, or Christ can be king of my part of the world, regardless of what everyone else chooses. I can choose, Jesus, you are my king. Sometimes we say, I wish the whole world would acknowledge him as king. Wouldn't that be great if the whole world would acknowledge him as king? That'll probably never happen. But the real question we need to be asking ourselves is, do I acknowledge him as king in my own life? Am I waiting for heaven to make him king? Or am I allowing him to rule now? Now, we don't know much about the wise men. In fact, we know nothing about the wise men after they left Bethlehem and went home. But I think they spent the rest of their lives studying Scripture to learn more about this king that they had just sworn their allegiance to. They wanted to follow his laws and decrees. And so we finally found this God that we've known about. And we want to find out everything we can about how to serve him. They wanted to follow his laws and decrees. I believe they listened carefully for news of what Jesus was doing. And they possibly even traveled back to Israel again when he started his ministry to hear from him firsthand. We don't know that for sure, but I believe just because the wise men wanted to know God's, I believe that they probably went back and listened to him. And after Jesus left the earth and the apostles were ministering, I think they probably followed the teachings of the apostles. We want to know how to be loyal subjects, how to really serve this king that we've sworn our allegiance to. The gold that the wise men brought symbolized the authority that Jesus had here on earth. They recognized that, but more than that, it recognized the authority that they were giving him in their own lives. Jesus still has that same authority, but only if we give it to him. The gifts that the wise men gave would have meant nothing if they hadn't already given him their hearts. The wise men made a purposeful choice to submit to the authority of Christ and make him king of their lives. Who rules your heart and your life? Do you love God only because of what he can do for you, only for what you think he will give you? Or do you admit that he is the best qualified to make the rules that govern your life? Because that's what a king does. A king makes the rules, and the subjects follow those rules. They don't question him. The king says it, they do it. And of course, in real life, there are a lot of penalties if they don't. There will be penalties for us choosing the wrong things to do, but they won't come until Judgment Day. We can float through life for many, many years disobeying the king's commands, but one day it will catch up to us. But we shouldn't serve him out of fear. We should recognize that he is the one that has the authority. He is the one that has the answers. And I'm going to learn everything I can and hold on to every word that he says, because I give him permission to rule my life. Have you accepted Christ as your Lord, as your King? He wants your heart.